Promise, we're now joined with Talmage Boston, a speaker, lawyer, historian, and author, to discuss his book, How the Best Did It, and Leadership Lessons from Our Presidents. Talmage, thank you for joining us today. Glad to have you and excited to talk about this book.
Well, honored to be on your show.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start with telling the readers on what inspired you to write this book, and what do you hope the readers gain from it?
Well, the book is timely. Obviously, we're in a presidential election year, and this is the lessons we can learn from our top presidents in a presidential election year. Certainly, our Democratic nominee and Republican nominee both are in need of serious leadership training, as they both demonstrated over their respective terms. I've been a student of presidential history since I was 7 years old, and this was a chance to kind of connect all the dots, and I call it a work of applied history. That is, it's great to know history, enjoy history, something else, be able to apply it to your daily living. So what the book attempts to do is to identify, on an average, 3 top leadership traits per president, explain how he used it to be successful, and then at the end, there's a series of questions, end of each chapter, that I call a mini workbook, whereby the reader can ask him or herself, how am I doing in these leadership traits? How am I doing in building consensus? How am I doing in being patient when patience is called for? How am I doing in playing hardball when the time has come to play hardball? How am I doing in inspiring optimism in my organization? So it's not just a book for people who love presidential history, although that's the subject matter, but it's really for anybody who is interested in improving their traits as a leader.
Right. And I like how you said, how am I doing? I am a big fan of President Abraham Lincoln, and I often think about his persistence and never giving up. And so I also ask myself often, am I pushing forward? Am I working as though I'm not going to be conquered and I'm not going to give up? So I think about the lessons that he taught all of us often. So can you share an example from your book of a leadership trait that exhibited one of the presidents that you find relevant in today's society?
Well, to use your favorite president and mine, Abraham Lincoln, the trait of being magnanimous, that is, being forgiving, staying above the fray, refusing to take the bait. And Lincoln, throughout his presidency, he started with his famous team of rivals candidate, 3 of whom had run against him for president, so they were not fans of him at the outset. 2 of the 3 quickly realized that Lincoln was the smartest guy in the room. The other, Salmon Chase, was always nipping at his heels, but Lincoln stayed above the fray, and when the time came to choose a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he forgave all of the slights and behind-the-back insults that Chase had leveled at him over the years and named him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He also had Union generals, particularly at the beginning of the war. They had gone to West Point. They thought they knew how to run a war. They thought Lincoln didn't. They thought he was out of his element. Well, they turned out to be incapable of running a war. Lincoln went to the Library of Congress, read all the books on military strategy, military history, and came up with a game plan that ultimately led to Union victory in the Civil War. And then, of course, his wife, Mary, who was an extremely difficult personality. Every day she woke up and found ways to make new enemies and no new friends. And Lincoln, in all these situations, whether with his cabinet, with his generals, with his wife, it would have been so easy to get bogged down in personality conflicts, and that takes away from the big goals. In Lincoln's case, the big goal was, I got to win the Civil War. I got to abolish slavery. I got to bring the country back together again. And so that's an incredibly important trait for a leader, not to get bogged down in petty personality conflicts, to stay focused on the goal, to be forgiving. Don't take the bait when insults come your way, and stay above the fray.
Right. And I like what you said about how, or it's a fact that Lincoln had his rivals in the same room. And if I apply it to just being in news, oftentimes people in the community, and I have friends like this, family members like this, that go and listen to the news stations that just repeat their opinion right back to them, instead of maybe going and listening to the opposite news station to then feel as though they are armored with both sides. of the table and the facts to then make an educated decision. And I feel like that's what President Lincoln was doing when he brought his rivals into the same room, was making sure he had all the facts and was able to really make a well-rounded decision, which can be applied in any industry, not just as a president.
Yeah, he didn't want to just not only have all the facts, he wanted the smartest guys.
Yeah.
He knew this was an incredible crisis that the country was in. He knew he was incapable of dealing with it on his own, that he needed outstanding minds to be giving different viewpoints. He'd be the final decision maker as president. But that just shows his ultimate self-confidence, that he was not going to be intimidated by these incredibly experienced, brilliant members of his cabinet, for whom he had these battles, these political battles that might well have taken a lesser man down or caused him to be less successful. But Lincoln wouldn't allow that to happen.
Right, exactly. And it sounds like you and I could probably talk about President Lincoln for a few hours.
That'd be fine with me.
So, I mean, just to move on a little bit, how did you distill the vast historical information about each president into practical lessons that people can apply?
Well, I'm still a practicing lawyer, and so I don't have time as a full-time lawyer to go to presidential libraries and read all the letters and the cursive handwriting that's illegible, because that's already been done by prior biographers many times over. So my approach was to read the top biographies of each of these 8 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan, and then distill from all these biographies. And they were amazingly consistent. There wasn't a whole lot of conflict. These biographers basically reached the same conclusion about exactly what each of these presidents made them great, and then write them up, trying to put into the text the most interesting stories that demonstrated the use of that leadership trait. So that was my approach. It was a 2-year project. I didn't want to duplicate any of the leadership traits, such that for 8 presidents, an average of 3 per president. The book has a total of 24 leadership traits. Now, obviously, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, nobody has all 24, but a leader can have many of them. And about reading how these presidents went about, say, I could do that. I need to be thinking about that. And so that's the desired outcome of the book, is it'll cause people who spend the time and study the history to come away and be better at what they do.
Right. And you mentioned that you tried to not duplicate different thoughts throughout the book. But what were some of the common leadership styles that you did see with these 8 presidents?
Well, among these 8, to me, there's 2 main common traits. The first is, to be a great leader, you've got to be a great persuader. You've got to cause people to want to follow you and do what you want to do. Each of these 8 were great persuaders, although they went about persuasion in their own unique ways. But nonetheless, that was the goal, that was the outcome, that was instrumental in them being so successful. The second controlling trait across the board was that they were all self-aware. And that means they knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, that they engaged their strengths to maximize them, and knowing where they were weak, they brought in people like Lincoln did with his team of rivals, like Washington did in bringing in Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton into his cabinet, and working with James Madison at the Constitutional Convention, identifying people who can get the job done that I know I can't do. I can do a lot of things, but I can't do everything. And I think that's one of the main problems that leaders fall into, political leaders. They try to micromanage everything, and that's a recipe for disaster. Do what you're good at and surround yourself with people who are very good at certain things that you have to admit you're not that good at. So those are the 2 common traits that I think every leader needs to get his or her arms around, in terms of, how am I persuading? Are people responding? Are they going my way? And how have I identified my strengths and weaknesses? Right. How have I brought into my inner circle people who can enhance me to overcome where I have some weakness?
Right. And to piggyback on that, the second one, you mentioned in your chapter with President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, about being open to fresh ideas. How do you believe leaders today can apply innovative ideas as Roosevelt did?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt greatly expanded the scope of the presidency. In particular, 1 year into office, there was this major national coal strike, and the parties couldn't resolve it. The coal workers and the coal company owners, and half the country was about to freeze to death because there wasn't enough coal. And so Theodore Roosevelt, who had no American president had ever injected himself into a labor dispute.
Right.
But he said, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. And so he did. He brought them together. He got them to agree to binding arbitration. That it did result in a settlement. Nobody froze to death. And there were other instances throughout his presidency where he kept doing that. That was one of his special strengths, was being able to mediate disputes, find common ground, bring people together, put an end to the disputes. Furthermore, as we all know, he looked around and saw the beautiful United States of America and said, well, who's going to protect the national parks?
Right. Who's
going to create wildlife refuges? No president had done that before, but somebody needs to do it. So getting back to today, a leader needs to say, what's out there that's really bothersome and is harming things that nobody's paying attention to? I need to direct my leadership toward those things and get those situations rectified. And that's just part of being a great leader. You have to be proactive in identifying problems, coming up with solutions to problems. And in many cases, there's no precedent from your predecessors in dealing with those. You've got to just take the initiative on your own. But that's what great leaders do.
Right. What made you put the self-examination questionnaires at the end of each chapter?
Well, I wanted the book to be an interactive experience. If I didn't have those questions there, somebody would read the chapter, read the traits, and say, okay, that's it. Into George Washington, on to Thomas Jefferson. And I didn't want that. I wanted, you finish the George Washington chapter, you need to think seriously about his specific traits. How can I apply them to myself? And how am I doing in these traits? So I wanted that kind of interactive experience for the reader. I think that's more likely to cause a reader to actually change his or her game as far as leadership is concerned, as opposed to simply just reading the history.
Right, exactly. So given your background in law and history, I'm an attorney as well. How do you think that how is your perspective on the intersection of your perspective and presidential leadership?
Well, if you're a lawyer, do you get the Texas Bar Journal?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, in the April issue, I have an article that explains how the skill set necessary to be a successful trial and appellate lawyer, which is what I do, is the identical skill set to be a successful historian. Both involve serious research. You better not miss things. You better not misstate things, or you're going to be embarrassed, whether it's in the courtroom or you produce a book that has false information in it. Lawyers and historians, obviously, we do a lot of writing. We do a lot of rewriting. We polish the language until it's as airtight as it can be.
Right.
We also do a lot of interviewing. As a lawyer, of course, you're interviewing, whether you're a mere witness interview or whether you're taking a deposition, the question and answer. And so I'm involved in the process of interviewing these biographers who have covered these presidents in detail before, and identifying their fine points that I can plug into my work. And then last but not least, you've got to be an advocate for your work. Right. As a trial lawyer, obviously in the courtroom, the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, if you're trying to get books sold, you got to come on TV shows like yours and be an advocate for your book. Right. Or present essays on your book. I'm a contributing columnist for the Dallas Morning News. Almost all my op-ed pieces are tied to presidential history, again with the idea, this is interesting, this is timely, it's an election year, but also kind of helping people say, man, I need to read that guy's book.
Yep. So just like the presidents in your book are all presidents, they've run into challenges throughout their presidency. Did you run into challenges while writing this book, and what were they, and how did you overcome them?
Well, the big challenge is just to make sure that the conclusions that I've drawn are going to be accepted by the experts in presidential history. And so what I did for every single one of my chapters, I had two leading biographers of that president read the chapter, tweak it. Did I miss anything? Did I misstate anything? Did I misanalyze anything? And I got that input before the chapter was finalized, which is why I have such confidence in my conclusions. Such that if you look at the back of the dust jacket, you have one of those major biographers of each of the 8 who has endorsed that chapter. On the front of the dust jacket, you got John Meacham, who's endorsing the whole book. So John Meacham, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Annette Gordon Reed, that's 3 Pulitzer Prize winners, but the others are leading presidential historians. Many are Pulitzer finalists, but nonetheless, I felt a responsibility, not because here I am. People say, well, what does a Dallas lawyer know? Why should I trust his conclusions about presidential history and leadership? And I say, don't trust me. I'll tell you the presidential historians who've read it and approved it, and I know you'll trust them because they're the experts. Right. And so I pull them together to make sure that the final product is sound, solid, and worth not only reading, but actually using to apply to your own leadership skills.
Right. And I like what you said, how you said you have a responsibility to make sure what you put out is factual and the truth. And I think that it is incumbent upon us as people to armor ourselves with the facts so that we can go out and make educated decisions and better our community. And this month is Diversity Month. So given the book has a national appeal, how do you think it resonates with a diverse audience?
Well, certainly, almost every chapter, one way or another, there are racial issues involved. George Washington was a slave owner. In the Revolutionary War, he saw African American soldiers who were very courageous, sacrificed for their countries, and yet they were still slaves. That bothered him so bad. Finally, shortly before his death, he changed his wills and frees his slaves. Thomas Jefferson, of course, has the 40-year relationship with Sally Hemings, by which he fathered 7 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood. And under the deal he made with Sally Hemings, upon his death, her children are freed. She is freed. Of course, Lincoln, race, Civil War, slavery. Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, less so. Eisenhower, of course, 1957, we've got Brown versus Board of Education, and he sends the National Guard and the Army into Little Rock to integrate the public schools. John F. Kennedy, he gives the 1963 speech after the Birmingham riots that a few days later, he submits for the first time ever a strong civil rights bill, and he then gets killed a few months later, which Lyndon Johnson carries through, and it becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it was John F. Kennedy, the first American president, to say this issue of civil rights is no longer a political issue, it is a moral issue.
Yeah, right.
And so these issues, which are integral to the history of our country, certainly find themselves into most of the precedents that are covered in the book.
Right. And if the people go and read this book and really listen to those lessons, it will definitely help us not repeat the mistakes, but it'll help us unite as people and move the ball forward.
Well, that's the goal. You know, I've got 8 presidents, and in the modern era, the last 100 years, I've got 2 Democrats, Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. I got 2 Republicans, Eisenhower and Reagan. And I think in this highly polarized time, I want Republicans to recognize we've had great Democratic presidents. I want Democrats to recognize we've had great Republican presidents. And I think that's an important message that not enough people stop and think about.
Right. That's a good message that you're trying to share. There's been great presidents on both sides of the aisle. And so, having received some of those endorsements that you mentioned just a few moments ago, how do you see how the best did it contributing to the ongoing conversation of leadership?
Well, I think it, number one, there's no more important American people in history than our presidents. They made the most important decisions of their eras. They had the biggest impact on our history, and therefore their life stories and their traits are always going to be hugely important. People are always going to be, from now, when you and I have grandchildren, when you have grandchildren, they're still going to be reading about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. So given the fact that everybody in an organization who has any ambition wants to lead, how can I be a better leader? What are the sources that I can go to that are reliable, that are truly going to be helpful? And that's what I think my book provides for somebody who's really trying to up his or her game. And nobody's ever done it like I have in this respect. My friend Evan Thomas, who's one of the top presidential biographers, who's on the back of the dust jacket, he said, Talmage, you're the only guy I know who could do this, because you got your foot in one arena, history, because this is my 5th book. Whenever leading historians have new books out, they come to Dallas, I interview them, several programs. So I'm in the big middle of the history world, but I've also, for 45 years, been a full-time commercial litigator in the business world, in the legal world.
Right.
And so I'm bringing all those perspectives together in a way that hopefully is going to have some real impact.
Right. Is there anything, Talmage, that I haven't asked you about this book that you want to share with the community?
Just that we're obviously living in a very troubled year, in a very troubled time, and it's easy to get down because of the choices that we face. And I think it's imperative for all of us to do our best to be optimistic despite the choices we have this year. And one of the best ways to be optimistic is to remember our rich history, remember the greatness of our past leaders, that 4 years from now, when these two guys, Biden and Trump, are gone, hopefully we're going to have a new generation of leaders who hopefully are going to embody these traits from our past great presidents. And so that's what I hope, as easy as it is to get down on today's presidential politics, don't let that destroy your appreciation for our great presidential history.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And so, East Texas, you heard it. We want you to pick up a copy of How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents, to, as Talmage said, to learn the greatness from our past leaders and use it to find greatness moving forward in our future. Talmage, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it and wish you well.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a joy to be on your show.
Thank you. Have a great day.